Hello and welcome to the program. My name is Luke Hunt and this is another podcast for the Diplomat. We're in Melbourne and with me today is Mylinh Lee, who is a prominent Australian PR specialist. She's also arrived here many years ago as a refugee and she's had much to do with the Vietnamese Museum of Australia. Mylinh, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Luke. It's lovely to see you again after so many years, and I'm really happy to be here.
Has been a while. Tell me about the museum. How did it get started? And I understand it's the first of its type on the planet.
Yes, I mean, it is such a great project, one that's very close to my heart, as I'm sure you know. It is going to be the first museum dedicated to the Vietnamese experience after they left Vietnam following the fall of Saigon in 1975. It captures thousands of stories of Vietnamese who've left and arrived in Australia. It is the world's first Vietnamese museum of its kind, and I think once it is launched in 2025, it's going to be like the sixth multicultural museum in Australia, so it's very exciting. And I think the Vietnamese community are mainly rallying behind it. It's needed. I mean, thousands of people have perished in the escape from the communist regime following 1975 collapse to the communist regime, and so you can imagine there's a lot of emotions, a lot of memories that they want to honour and restore. It's not just about refugees fleeing, capturing their stories, but it's also the vets who fought in the Vietnam War, you know, sons and husbands who have lost their lives to that period of time. It's very emotional.
It was an extraordinary period. And I remember I was like 12 or 13 when the first boat started arriving. I think it was Malcolm Fraser who opened the gates and said, yes,
that's right,
let them come in. You were among those. And
definitely. My family and I left. So I was very young, around about 6 to 7 years old when we fled on a flimsy fishing boat. And it was in 79. My parents tried to leave pretty much earlier than that, but we got not captured, but the people that were organising the boat to flee took off without us.
Right.
There's a lot of corruption, you know, people were desperate to leave the country, so they took my parents' money and others as well and scammed us, obviously, and so wasn't successful. So then my parents had to build up their savings again, and thankfully we were lucky in 1979 when we left, and it was horrific. It was, and you know, I mean, I can tell you a lot more about the stories of our escape, but what I can say is that Malcolm Fraser was absolutely instrumental in helping Vietnamese settle in Australia. In fact, it was his government's immigration policies in the mid-70s after the fall of Saigon that basically sent something like 50,000 Vietnamese into Australia. And so you talk to a lot of the Vietnamese in the know and they love Malcolm Fraser.
Right.
In fact, we held a fundraiser earlier this year to raise money for the museum, which is in construction phase. And his widow, so Tammy Fraser, was the guest of honour. And this is beautiful. And, you know, like everybody was like saying thank you to her because, you know, if it wasn't for Malcolm Fraser and his team at the time, we wouldn't be here. Because, you know, Australia had just come through. I mean, you know, white supremacy was still quite fresh in that. I mean, it was still quite kind of bubbling away. Of course, you know, Australia was one of the countries that came to help the 2 million Vietnamese who fled. And here's the thing, Luke, like out of the 2 million who fled Vietnam from the war, 50% of them perished.
That's a lot of people.
From, at sea, due to drowning, dehydration, starvation, or they were killed and raped by pirates, and that was rife during that time because, you know, they knew that people were fleeing with, you know, their worldly possessions. So lots of robbery, you know, there's been so many horrific stories, and people who made it to even like one of the Red Cross islands who were taking in refugees, they also died of disease and stuff. So only half survived. I'm very lucky, you know.
It still goes on today.
Yes, I can
Sri Lankan
imagine.
refugees from India.
That's right, and the waves won't stop because I think as long as we have war in the world, there's going to be many, you know, generations of people trying to escape oppression and rebuild their lives with their family and their kids. So we have to keep an eye out on that, I think.
I remember on several occasions in Vietnam, speaking to children of Vietnamese refugees who had gone back to Vietnam, often to do business. And it was interesting, their take, and where they say they were different was that with a lot of those refugees, especially those of Chinese ancestry, after the invasion of Cambodia and the big fight that happened in northern Vietnam when the Chinese invaded, that those of Chinese ancestry, they basically had a gun pointed at them and they were told to leave.
That's right, yes.
And
Yes.
And because of the way they arrived in Australia, there was never a thought of going back to Vietnam. And now they were in Australia, that was it. They had to make the best of what they had, unlike other migrants who were arriving from all around the planet, who always had the option of going home.
That's right. Exactly. And to that point, Luke, I think it's really important for everyone that discusses this experience to understand that there are definitions pertaining to refugees and to migrants. It's very different. Like, I think if you look at what the United Nations say, the term refugee is often used very interchangeably with the term migrant, but there are marked differences, okay? Like a refugee, according to the UN, is that it's a person who are outside their country of origin for reasons of, say, of feared persecution, conflict, violence, and as a result require international protection. Whereas the migrant is not like that. So you've got to understand refugee and migrants are two very different types of immigration, I guess you can say. So yeah, no, like if you bring it back to my family and other Chinese, Vietnamese, or even just Vietnamese refugees, that we knew when we arrived in Australia that this is our home now. My parents still have siblings in Vietnam, and it took them a long time to be able to go back in a way that is safe once they've got their Australian passport, right? But it took years, and my parents still don't trust.
Well, they weren't welcomed back in the perhaps up until about late 2000. That's kind of roughly what I'm thinking. That it wasn't really until the economy went pear-shaped, and then earlier in 2005 that they were actually welcomed back into Vietnam, and there was, I think, a much more honest relationship was forged. I mean, it was helped. I mean, it's ruthlessly communist, but at the same time, they've had many changes of government since 75, and I think that's helped as well.
Yes, it has. It kind of has opened up, and I think refugees who fled feel a little bit safer going back, because I think there was a generation of Vietnamese returning back called the Viet Qs, who would bring in money. They've set up enterprises, they've set up hotels or restaurants. They, instill trade between the two countries, whether it's, Vietnam to America because Vietnamese are now everywhere, right, because of the refugees experience. Sure. So they are bringing in sort of investment into Vietnam. I think they're welcomed. And then a lot of people are sending back money too. Those who were lucky enough to survive their escape and have established themselves in the West, so to speak, they are sending money back. And so Vietnamese who remained and didn't have the means to escape because you had to pay your way onto like a boat, right? They would then get sort of money from their families overseas, and they set up businesses too. So I think all of that feed into the whole kind of general feeling that the economy is better if they are Vietnamese who fled are allowed back in. But still, I think if you talk to older generation, the trust is not completely there. But now it's safe to go back as long as they've got a passport of another nation. I mean, the only passport I have is the Australian passport, and I'm very grateful for it. And I always want to give back in terms of the jobs that I do. Is about public service. I deliberately, intentionally choose to work for the public sector because I want to help inform on policies in areas where I can. But other people want to go and build stuff in Vietnam as a way to look after their family and progress that way. But yeah.
Tell me about the trip out.
Oh.
You're on an island.
Yes, that's right.
Stranded for a long time.
Oh, look, I was only 7 years old, but I remember it was it was midnight. We basically left Ho Chi Minh City, or it was Saigon then, and went into like a little sort of holding spot on the edge of a river where we were going to be taken out to the boat. And it was the death of night. And I remember my mum was saying to me that, you know, all we were allowed was like the clothes on our back. And my family, there was like me and my 3 brothers at the time, my fourth brother born in Australia. But so I was only like 6 years old. We were given sleeping pills.
Oh, really?
Yep. So that kids were given sleeping pills because they didn't want children to cry and therefore wake the communists who were patrolling the rivers. So went in, and there was like something about 400 people on a boat that we thought were only supposed to be 150. So the person that were organising the boat took in a lot more people than they should. So we found ourselves on the bottom deck, like packed like sardines. And I just remember that I was very seasick as we left to the mouth of the river, to the ocean, and there were guns being sort of shot at us. But we were lucky. And so I remember that the journey was quite peaceful in the sense that we didn't have massive storms, but there were a lot of people just being seasick. And then water was understood to be like running out really quickly. And I remember lying on the floor of the boat and getting like a door swung at my head, and people were going to the toilet everywhere. It was just disgusting and filthy and just very tiring. And I think my dad was saying that he just couldn't really breathe down there. So then he would go up with, you know, a lot of the young men who prefer to be on the upper deck, and they would try and search for a rescue boat. We didn't know how long we were going to be at sea. Food was rationed out, but people were starting to panic. And then Lord of the Flies mentality, survival, you know, sort of kicked in, and there were, you know, reports on the 4th day of people stealing food. So as you can imagine, it was getting really chaotic. So it happened that when you're at sea, it's so dark, Luke, right? Stars weren't even enough to really light the way, but we saw a flame in the distance. So cutting it short, we were at sea for like 5 days, maybe 6 nights, 5 days, when we saw this flame ahead of us, and it turned out to be an offshore oil rig. Okay, and it's a Canadian offshore oil rig. So we basically we sailed there, and at first the people working on the offshore says, no, you can't come in because we don't know who you are. But then one of the people on the boat knew that if we weren't going to get onto this offshore oil rig, we could die because there was no land visible anywhere. So one of them tried to climb up on those, you know, the ladders, and the motion of the sea with the boat, our boat, and kind of crashed into the offshore oil rig, basically damaging the boat. But he kind of nearly severed his thumb, so then blood was gushing out. And so, of course, the people on the offshore oil rig says, oh my gosh, come up for medical attention. That they waved like this, and so to all the 400 pairs of eyes, it's like, oh yes, we are rescued. So everybody starts scurrying up, and so about that time, I think that the commander of that offshore oil rig says, okay, well, look, let's just go up. And so I think what happened right is that I'm not too sure about international law, but I think they can rescue you if the boat's sinking.
Sure.
So I think, because our boat was damaged,
I think they're obligated.
Yeah, that's right. I think they've decided that it's going to be this one that they're going to rescue. I'm sure there were many boats that went past and didn't quite succeed, but we were in trouble, right? The boat was damaged. So anyway, so luckily we were rescued. So I would say that I was very lucky, because, you know, you hear stories of people who've been at sea for like weeks, and they see their loved ones being thrown over because they died from dehydration. Like horrific stories. You've heard of people who watched their sister get raped by pirates. You've seen people just throwing themselves over because they couldn't handle the madness of the elements and starvation and all that. So just horrific conditions. So I guess the museum tries and capture that whole traumatic period of time. You're talking about 1975 to 1997.
Sure, I'm even thinking a bit later, because what you're saying,
yes,
all the hallmarks of human smuggling.
That's right.
And they tend to call it immigration. I have my doubts, but people seeking asylum and making these journeys, more so now towards Europe, but we saw it again in Australia, and turn the boats back.
That's right.
All these sorts of issues that were coming, but the experiences of these people at sea, it hasn't changed.
It hasn't changed, and I think, I mean, you know, as somebody who's been in that boat, there was a period in Australian history recently about turn back the boats, all that kind of stuff. It brought back so many memories for me, and I could never be a part of that. I would say, please don't turn back the boats. Take them all. We've got such huge, massive land. You know, if people do not leave their country and take such a huge chance of, it's 50% or even less of survival. You know, you can't turn back the boats if they are in need to leave their country in such a dangerous way. That's saying something.
Sure.
So anyway, that's obviously, I'm coming from the frame of reference that, you know, I was on that boat and I was lucky that offshore oil rig didn't turn us back, took us on, but not everyone's that lucky. But yeah, no, I think what's happened with, I mean, I think recently there was a boat that had 700 people on it near Greece that capsized, and you know, they were asking for help. They were obviously fleeing somewhere, but the world's attention was on finding the submarine. Remember that? Yeah, so that says to me that those 700 souls perished, maybe because it's not making news anymore, but I mean, that's just an example of the continuous humanitarian crisis that we're seeing.
Yeah, and one would think the UN could do a bit more about this, but how did you get from the oil rig to Australia?
Great question. We were camped along the offshore. I remember I'd lost my shoes, I lost everything. All I had was just a summer dress on, right? And I remember walking on the steel of the offshore oil rig, and it was made for heavy boots, right? So that just so people don't slip, and it was really hard on the feet, and I remember getting pierced on the metal. But anyway, it's really interesting how you remember things. We were there for about a couple of nights, and I think they radioed the Red Cross, who then sent a boat from Malaysian, because we were near Malaysia at that time, and the boat came the next morning, or that 2 mornings after, and basically took us from the offshore oil rig to an island called Pulau Tangga, which is a smaller one than the Pulau Bidong, which is the main island where a lot of Vietnamese refugees went, where they kind of processed us. Meaning,
this was in Malaysia?
Yeah, we were in Malaysian waters, you know. So it was a Malaysian island which the Red Cross has taken over because of this crisis, right? Of so many people started fleeing. So they've set up camp. So basically we were on a boat from the offshore oil rig onto a boat that took us to the island, and then they kind of lined us, once we got to the island, lined us by family and, you know, age group and all that kind of stuff, and they basically processed us. The Red Cross then had a team where they just basically wrote, like, you know, which boat are you from, how old you are, which family, and then it was an interesting kind of place, because it was like a transit lounge, because just to put that very sort of flippantly, but it's like, you know, we arrived, and then the immigrant or the refugees who were before us were leaving at the same time, because you remember, like, the United Nations sent in all the countries who brought in to come, and every country, and by the way, Australia really insisted on having first go at, like, interviewing the refugees,
which had become a bit of a policy back then.
Yeah, they really wanted, like, you know,
the best ones.
That's right.
In fact, the Americans, they set the benchmark on that one, in that after 75 and the collapse of South Vietnam, the Americans would send in their teams, and they would have choice pick of the people seeking asylum, refugees. They wanted the better ones.
No, well,
so the Australians obviously followed suit.
Well, yes, and in our family's experience, my dad worked for the US Army Consultants,
which would have helped.
Yes, so his loyalty was to the US. But because apparently Australia wanted first go at interviewing the refugees to pick the best ones, we were picked because we were a young family. My dad could speak a bit of English. They could see that maybe that we could be moulded to assimilate easy, because there were like 4 kids under 7 years old, and, you know, my mum came across as being educated. So we were picked, and my dad was like, I remember he came back to our little makeshift tent saying, "Oh, hey, the news is that we got selected." And Mum says, "Great, we're saved." Yeah, but it's not the US. So yes, but I think, Luke, you find that eventually a lot of countries, when Australia and then other Switzerland, Canada, they all kind of want to do the same kind of policy, and so at the end, those who were not picked, the US took all because they felt a bit of responsibility because of what's happened, which I think is quite magnanimous of them. But yeah,
they have been very good over the years. I think.
Well, we can talk about how they left the war, but I mean that's another podcast. Perhaps.
Well, yeah, no, I've had that subject before, but it's problem with the Americans, which we saw in Kabul, is when a war is no longer politically palatable and there's a change in government, they're pretty quick to drop you.
Yes.
And there's a lot of people who, they like to say that the Americans lost the Vietnam War, and my argument's always been they didn't lose the Vietnam War. They abandoned South Vietnam, which had been a firm ally for decades. And it's there's a bit of a different twist.
It is. I think I have many American friends, and I'm very fond of America in the sense that they always seem to step up when it's, you see it on the world stage. The Americans are always trying to help, do the right thing.
Sure. And we're seeing it in Vietnam still. There was a big rebellion by the Hmong in the Central Highlands not that long ago. The Americans do step in, and they have taken a lot of Hmong over the years, and they did take the children who weren't accepted in Vietnam because they were of mixed race, and particularly those who were mixed race with African fathers. They were totally eschewed by the local communities, and the Americans, they're not as bad as everybody would like to make out.
That's right, and definitely politics come into play. In our experience, we're grateful. My dad had a good experience when he was helping them out. He didn't see front line because he had a bad eye, so he was recruited by, it was conscription with the South Vietnam Army. But I think Dad told me that he worked in some kind of the centre, like the operation hub, where he wrote how many civilians were killed, like signage. He wrote signage in Vietnamese and in just basically because I didn't have computers then, right?
Yep.
So so he worked on the communications, I suppose, branch of that. Anyway, so we're just grateful that Australia took us in at the end of all this. I'm trying to write about these experiences for my children and my family. Just for the audience's sake, you've started writing the book. That's right. It's taken me a couple of years to sort of come to this space where I'm now sort of 7 chapters in. It's quite a traumatic experience to write about it. But
it's also difficult to write about yourself.
Yeah, it is. And, growing up in the 80s in Australia, one of the first wave of Asian refugees in the country is also an interesting arc in itself. So working through that, hoping to get the book out by next year. I've set myself a timeline because the museum is opening in 2025 to commemorate the 50th year of Vietnamese refugees' arrival into Australia and into Melbourne. For me, I just wanted to make sure that I also finish the book. So I'm trying to get the book finished by next year.
Yeah, it's a good timeline. I was interviewing Roland Naveau a couple of weeks ago. In fact, he was my last podcast for the Diplomat, and he was in Cambodia in 75 and Vietnam. And there's a lot of people planning quite a few things for the 50th anniversary in 75 in Vietnam and in Cambodia.
Oh, right, okay.
And obviously here as well.
Yes. Well, certainly Cambodian's history is very linked with Vietnam.
Sure.
There's a lot of Vietnamese Cambodian who went through the same terrible traumatic experience of fleeing Vietnam. Chinese, Vietnamese too. Like, it's much more than just Vietnamese, So all their stories are all important, which brings me to the museum. It's a 4 or 5 story construction in Footscray,
which is an inner suburb in Melbourne.
That's right, yes. So the federal government has invested in this, and so has the state government. Groundbreaking of this museum will take place next year, early 2024, and the grand opening will be in 2025. But I've seen the architecture. I mean, it's quite thoughtfully put together by an architect firm. The Vietnamese community had to buy the land.
Right.
So we weren't given the land that this museum is going to be constructed on. It's a multi-million-dollar piece of land that we got and we use funding to help us, and we're raising funds.
The government does tend to work that way. You know, you show us the interest, well, you provide the land, and we'll. How much did they cough up?
Oh well, I think so, there's two. The museum's getting rolled out in two phases. I think the first phase is getting something like 17 million.
Right.
Which, I mean, the government is really putting some thought and investment and some support behind this, and we're very grateful as a community from both sides of the spectrum. So it's a good thing. It's going to be a great little space for people. It's also an education space as well. It's not just for those to come and reflect on the experience, to honour those who've passed away because of the experience, to honour those who fought for freedom. But it's just a space for stories to be captured. It's a space for people to come and, reflect, give thanks, and to educate. It's basically a beacon of human rights in some ways. I think the people who work on the museums, we want to fight for human freedom, not only in Vietnam, but around the world and in Australia.
Do you find the Vietnamese diaspora is becoming more political as the years have gone by? I mean, I can remember when it was, my mother worked in a library in a high school where there was an enormous throughput of Vietnamese Cambodian refugees, and they're always kind of, Mum liked them a lot, but they were always very kind of meek, mild, timid, as you were saying, here we are kind of thing. But I mean, they're as Australian as everybody else.
Yes.
And there's a lot of politics going on with the Cambodian diaspora particularly, but also with the Vietnamese as well.
100%, yes.
Are they becoming more active in regards to the countries from which they came?
That's a great question, Luke. I would say that they are getting more confident in voicing their thoughts. I think politics has always been the subtext of every Vietnamese experience, because this is the reason why we're here, right? You know.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So it's in our blood in that sense, and in the community, you know what everyone thinks in terms, because they vocalize it. But I think too is that the culture is that we don't actively go out because we're scared of punishment. Because in Vietnam, right, you couldn't be openly protesting because you'd be put in jail. So
Indeed, still.
Yeah, and still. So the older generation of Vietnamese in Australia are still like that. They don't vocalise, but the young ones, the firstborn generation who've heard their parents' stories, or people like me who were children when we came here, we are now more confident to share our thoughts and our point of views and to basically, be honest about what happened with us, right? So to answer your question, yes, but there are obviously different factions in the community who say, stop saying that, or, let's not think about the past, or why are you dragging that up? And there's other sort of sectors of the community that's saying, no, we need to air out our trauma so that this doesn't happen again. So yes, political. There's also a little bit of agitation within the community.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah.
Between the Cambodians and the Vietnamese,
Correct.
there's an enormous one, and there's also, I'm not Cambodian or Vietnamese, but I have spent a lot of time up there, and I am surprised at how ill-informed some people are when they've been here for a long time, and a lot of the issues that they hang on to simply don't exist anymore.
That's correct. I mean, an example of that would be the flag.
Right.
Which flag will the Vietnamese Museum of Australia in Melbourne, when it opens...
Yellow, red stripes and a red star?
That's correct, yeah.
That will annoy them.
Oh my goodness. So, yes, obviously the current flag in Vietnam is the red with the star,
sure,
right? But the people who fled Vietnam...
Well, they fled South Vietnam.
That's right.
Which was another country.
Yes. It is the yellow with the red stripes.
Yep.
So, interestingly, and I need to point this out, the VMA, Vietnamese, they're going to... It's in our constitution when we drew up the charity organisation and setting up this whole organisation. We will be flying the yellow and stripe flag.
Right.
We are not... Yes, so that's...
Be warned, Hanoi.
Yes, so that is going to be interesting once... that is, And already people are like debating that. But I think if you're talking about a museum that honours the
Right, I mean, you can't deny it.
Yeah.
It was there was a similar issue not that long ago when the Australian Mint came out with a coin that had the South Vietnamese flag on it. I mean, Australian soldiers fought and died there. They weren't doing it for the communist flag. They were there for a purpose, and it was to defend that flag.
That's right. So that's a really emotional, pivotal point that I think is going to be interesting to see the narrative of later. Yeah, the flag's important to us.
On that note, Mylinh Lee, thank you very much. It's been delightful.
Oh, thank you, Luke. Well, you ask great questions as always, and been following your journey of being a journalist that you are, and yes, all respect to you, and thank you so much for the opportunity to share a bit of our experience today.
We must do it again when the book comes out and when the museum is open.
Absolutely, look forward to that. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks very much.